We all know Clint Eastwood as a Hollywood legend, but what if I told you that beyond the big screen he made a real-life impact in the most unexpected way? Today's story is about a struggling man lost in life and the moment that turned everything around, all because Clint Eastwood chose to listen. The autumn air in Boston carried a crisp chill, though the golden afternoon sun softened its bite. Inside a small corner diner, the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon lingered in the air. Seated near the window, Clint Eastwood stirred his coffee leisurely, his sunglasses perched on the bridge of his nose. The Hollywood icon, though older now, still carried an unmistakable presence, calm, composed, and deeply observant. He wasn't seeking attention, yet every now and then a passerby would steal a hesitant glance, debating whether to approach him. Across the street, Ethan lingered on the sidewalk, shifting his weight between tired feet. His clothes, layered and worn from weeks on the streets, bore the creases of long nights spent on cold concrete. A former carpenter, he had once prided himself on his steady hands, but now they trembled slightly from hunger. It had been 2 days since he'd had a full meal, and his pride had been whittled down by necessity. His fingers clenched around the single-dollar bill he had left, not nearly enough to buy anything substantial. Ethan's eyes drifted to Clint, seated at the diner's window, looking as if he belonged to another world. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. What would a man like that care about someone like me, he thought bitterly. But hunger had a way of silencing doubts. Taking a deep breath, he forced his legs to move, crossing the street one slow step at a time. When he reached the diner's entrance, he hesitated once more before pushing the door open. As the bell above the door jingled, Clint's gaze lifted toward him. This was it. Ethan exhaled and took the hardest step, asking for help. Ethan approached Clint's table cautiously, his throat dry as he struggled to find the right words. His voice came out softer than he intended, barely above a whisper. "Sir, do you have $1 to spare?" He expected the usual response, avoidance, a polite dismissal, or at best, a few coins tossed his way without a second glance. Instead, Clint slowly set his coffee down, removed his sunglasses, and studied Ethan with an expression that was unreadable yet intense. The silence stretched between them, making Ethan shift uncomfortably under the weight of Clint's gaze. Had he made a mistake asking? Finally, Clint leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly. $1, huh?" His tone was neutral, neither condescending nor dismissive. Then, after a pause, he gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, let's talk." Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Sit? With Clint Eastwood? He hesitated, searching the older man's face for a sign that this was some kind of joke, but there was no mockery in Clint's expression, only curiosity. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. People usually avoided making eye contact with him, let alone invited him to sit down. Why was this man different? With an awkward nod, Ethan slid into the seat across from Clint, his hands resting uneasily in his lap. His cardboard sign, tucked under his arm, nearly slipped onto the table, and he hurried to straighten it, suddenly self-conscious. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't before, as if Clint could see past the grime and worn-out clothes to something deeper. Why was he doing this? Ethan had no idea, but for the first time in a long while, someone was willing to listen. Ethan exhaled, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his jacket sleeve. He wasn't used to talking about himself. At least, not anymore. People didn't ask. People didn't care. But Clint sat there, waiting, his steady gaze unwavering, and for some reason, that made the words come easier than Ethan expected. "I wasn't always like this," Ethan started, his voice low but steady. "I used to be a carpenter, a damn good one too." His fingers curled slightly as if remembering the feel of a hammer in his grip. He cleared his throat and continued, his words tumbling out in pieces. He had spent years working with his hands, building homes, fixing roofs, crafting things that lasted. He loved his work. It gave him purpose. But then the economy took a hit and the jobs dried up. At first he thought it would pass. He tightened his belt, cut back on spending, dipped into his savings. But the months stretched on, and the calls for work stopped coming. One late payment turned into 2, then 3, he admitted, his voice growing bitter. Soon, the bank didn't care about the years I'd spent breaking my back to pay that mortgage. They just wanted the money. Eventually, he lost his house, then his truck, then everything else. It doesn't take long to go from doing all right to sleeping in a doorway. Ethan glanced down at his hands, calloused but now shaking slightly. I tried to get back up, I really did. He explained how he searched for work every day, but no one wanted to hire a homeless man with no address, no phone, and no clean clothes. He would scrape together change doing odd jobs, but it was never enough. People looked at him like he was invisible, or worse, like he was a lost cause. He swallowed hard, suddenly feeling ashamed for talking too much. He glanced up at Clint, half expecting the same look of quiet pity he'd grown accustomed to. But Clint's face remained calm, thoughtful, not judging, just listening. That was more than most people had done in years. Ethan let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. Funny, isn't it? I spent my whole life building homes for other people, and now I can't even afford a roof over my own head. The words hung in the air between them. Ethan clenched his jaw, bracing for Clint's response, but what Clint said next was something he never expected. Clint didn't respond right away. He let the weight of Ethan's words settle between them, the quiet hum of the diner filling the space. Then, after a long moment, he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His expression didn't hold pity or judgment, just something Ethan couldn't quite place. Understanding. You think you're the only one who's been knocked down? Clint finally said, his voice calm but firm. I grew up in the middle of the Great Depression. You know what that means? It means I know what it's like to go to bed hungry. I know what it's like to watch your parents scrape by, wondering if there's going to be enough food on the table the next day. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly. He had heard stories about the Depression, but somehow he had never imagined Clint Eastwood, a man who had spent decades playing cowboys, outlaws, and larger-than-life heroes, having lived through anything like that. Clint continued, his voice steady, as if recalling memories he didn't often speak of. I didn't come from money. I wasn't handed an easy path. I worked damn hard for everything I have. But you know what made the biggest difference? He paused, watching Ethan closely. Someone gave me a chance. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Clint leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving Ethan's. I was just a scrawny kid when a mechanic in my neighborhood offered me my first real job, cleaning tools in his shop. It wasn't much, but it gave me something I didn't have before, a place to start. He exhaled, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't look at me like I was some charity case. He saw potential. He saw someone worth investing in. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. No one had talked to him like that in years. Most people assumed he was a lost cause, too far gone to turn things around. But Clint? Clint was looking at him like he still had something left to fight for. So tell me, Clint said, his voice quieter now, what's your next chapter? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Next chapter? He hadn't thought about the future in a long time. Survival had become his only goal. But Clint's words stirred something in him, a flicker of something he thought he had lost. Ethan sat in silence, Clint's question lingering in his mind like an echo in an empty room. A next chapter? He hadn't thought beyond surviving the next cold night, the next hungry morning. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. I don't know, he admitted. I've tried before. Nothing ever works out. Clint didn't flinch at the doubt in Ethan's voice. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out what Ethan assumed would be a few bills. A typical way to end this kind of conversation. But instead of cash, Clint slid a business card across the table. Ethan hesitated before picking it up, his fingers tracing over the printed letters. It wasn't a charity, it wasn't some shelter that would offer a cot for the night and send him back to the streets in the morning. Boston Woodworks Skilled Training and Employment Assistance. Ethan's breath caught slightly. His hands, once steady with a hammer and saw, now trembled against the carpet. Go here, Clint said, his tone firm but not unkind. It's a woodshop training program. A friend of mine runs it. They help guys like you get back on their feet. Not with handouts, but with work, with a future. Ethan swallowed hard, staring at the card as if it were some kind of foreign object. Could he trust this? Could he trust Clint? "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Because someone once did it for me." Ethan walked out of the diner with the business card clutched tightly in his hand, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had expected $1, maybe a few kind words before being sent on his way. Instead, Clint Eastwood had given him something far more dangerous: hope. Hope required effort. Hope meant taking a risk, and Ethan wasn't sure he had it in him anymore. He wandered aimlessly through the streets, staring down at the card, turning it over in his fingers. He had been through programs before, ones that promised to help but left him feeling like just another statistic. What if this place was the same? What if he showed up and they turned him away? He had gotten used to rejection, but this felt different. This was Clint Eastwood vouching for him. What if he failed? His feet carried him past a hardware store where a display of freshly polished tools caught his eye. Hammers, saws, measuring tapes, things he once held with confidence. His reflection in the shop window looked back at him, tired, worn, but still standing. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his last few dollars. It wasn't much, but enough for something small. Across the street, a laundromat's neon sign flickered in the early evening light. Ethan exhaled. If he was going to show up at Boston Woodworks, he didn't want to walk in looking like just another man off the streets. It wasn't much, but it was a step. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first real step he'd taken in years. Ethan stood outside Boston Woodworks, his freshly laundered clothes still slightly damp from the dryer. The workshop's large industrial doors were open, revealing the rhythmic sound of hammers, the scent of fresh-cut wood, and the hum of saws in motion. He hesitated for a moment, gripping the business card Clint had given him like a lifeline. Was this really happening? Doubt gnawed at him, but something stronger, something Clint had ignited in him, pushed him forward. Stepping inside, he was greeted by a man in his 60s with rough, calloused hands and a welcoming nod. "You Clint's guy?" the man asked. Ethan nodded hesitantly. "Good. We don't do handouts here. You ready to work?" Ethan swallowed hard. Work. The word felt foreign but familiar, like a tool he hadn't picked up in years. "Yeah," he said. "I am." They started him with simple tasks: sanding wood, organizing tools, cleaning up the workspace. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and it was his. For the first time in years, his hands felt steady again. The motions came back, muscle memory kicking in. The longer he worked, the more he remembered who he used to be. Not a homeless man begging for $1, but a skilled craftsman, a builder. Weeks passed, and the workshop became more than just a place to work. It became a place to rebuild. With a steady paycheck, Ethan was able to rent a small room, enough to finally have a door to close at night. He kept Clint's business card tucked in his wallet, a reminder of the day everything changed. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't just surviving. He was moving forward. One evening after a long shift at the workshop, Ethan sat at the small desk in his rented room, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the paper in front of him. He tapped the pen against the table, hesitating. What was there to say? How could he possibly put into words what Clint Eastwood had done for him? Taking a deep breath, he started writing. "Clint, I don't know if you even remember me, but months ago you sat with me in a diner when no one else would. You didn't give me $1, you gave me a chance. I just wanted to say thank you." He went on to tell Clint about the woodshop, the job, the small room he now called home. He told him how, for the first time in years, he had purpose again. He didn't expect a response. It wasn't about that. It was about closure. About acknowledging the man who had seen something in him when he couldn't see it himself. Weeks later, Clint sat in his quiet office, unfolding the letter carefully. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he read. He had kept other letters like this over the years. reminders that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple into something greater. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in his drawer. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself drawn to others like him, men who had lost their way, who needed someone to believe in them. He started volunteering at Boston Woodworks, helping train new workers. One day, a young man hesitated at the door, unsure whether to step in. Ethan walked over and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You're here," Ethan said with a small smile. "That means your story isn't over yet." The story of Ethan and Clint Eastwood teaches a powerful lesson about the impact of kindness, second chances, and self-worth. It reminds us that a single moment of compassion can change the course of a person's life. Clint didn't offer Ethan a quick fix. He offered him an opportunity, something far more valuable. In doing so, he showed that sometimes what people need isn't charity, but belief in their potential. Another key takeaway is that everyone has a story, and no one's journey is over until they decide it is. Ethan believed he was beyond saving, trapped in a cycle of failure, but Clint challenged him to see his life as a story still being written. That shift in perspective gave Ethan the courage to take the hardest step, trying again. The story also reinforces the idea that helping others doesn't always require grand gestures. A simple conversation, a listening ear, or pointing someone toward an opportunity can make all the difference. In the end, Ethan's transformation came full circle. Just as Clint had once been helped, Ethan later became the one offering hope to others. Sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who believes in you.